Hello everybody, my name is Kat Bowser. I'm your resident fantasy therapist and welcome to my channel. Happy Halloween. We are in the last day of our Halloween week and I decided to save one of my favorite topics for last. And I actually had quite a few viewers bring this up to me a couple of times, so I'm actually really glad to get to talk about it. In fantasy, in sci-fi, in fiction in general, we usually have a villain that somehow has absolute power. They are a dictator, they are a malevolent monarch, they're an evil god, whatever. So the question was raised, how do people get absolute power? And this is actually a really fun question because it really varies. Most of the time, when I'm considering how to do a villain who has absolute power and considering how they got absolute power, my first place that I look for inspiration is history, because unfortunately, we have several examples of that. But one thing that we have discovered over the years is that there are elements that they have in common. Bear in mind, there is always going to be variation because each time we essentially have an absolute ruler come to power, it is a very unique situation. But we can at least look what they have in common. So, first and foremost, there has to be either some kind of crisis going on, or there has to be a reason that people will give up power. Case in point, fear, economic strife, things like that, loss of identity, things of that nature. Because when people are happy, they generally aren't going to welcome someone coming in and saying, hey, I'm going to rule over you guys because I know how to take care of you. Well, we're doing just fine. Go away. We don't need you. That's why most of the time when these people take power, it is literally a perfect storm of circumstances. So let's look at the most obvious example. Let's look at Hitler. So Hitler did not take power by force. He was elected in. And the reason that he was so honestly welcomed by the people is because after World War I, Germany got the real short end of the stick. They were in an economic crisis because they were having to pay back all these reparations from World War I. Then you had the Great Depression, which made it worse. Granted, it started in the United States. It very quickly went around the world because countries trade and deal with each other, and different banks coordinate with each other. So it did spread. And Germany was already in a economic depression, and here comes another depression on top of that depression. It got to the point where people were literally wallpapering their houses with money because it was useless. There was such hyperinflation that you would literally have to fill a wheelbarrow full of money just to buy bread. So that was one thing that was going on. Second thing is it had essentially been hammered into the people of Germany that their people were horrible, their people had caused, this worldwide war, their people were unworthy of pride, things like that. They'd essentially been stripped of their national pride because everybody in the world hated them at that point. And something that unfortunately the other rulers forgot is that while yes, the leaders of Germany during World War I did not make the best decisions, the common people really didn't have a lot to do with it. It's kind of like, nowadays we look at countries that do these horrible things, but we have to remember it's not every person in the country that's doing it. It's the people that have control and can make the political decisions. So that was going on. And so here comes Hitler, this very charismatic individual who quickly does what is another thing that's common with all these situations, is that he aligns himself with the common people. So I mentioned this briefly in my interpersonal intelligence video. Basically, these leaders are people that understand emotion. They understand how people communicate. They understand people's feelings, how to determine what they want. I've mentioned it before, but Hitler was a very good speaker because he made people feel personally involved. He would gesture to a section of the audience, but he would gesture so it looked like he was looking at one individual, but every individual in that section thought he was looking at them. So that personified it, like, okay, I'm important enough, he's talking to me. And the other thing is, Hitler had some failures before he took power. He was arrested for an attempt essentially at a government coup, essentially. And while he was in prison, he wrote Mein Kampf, which was essentially his way of saying, I understand the struggle of the common people. I understand what they want. I understand how unfair it is. So these people understand empathy. It doesn't mean that they necessarily have it, but they understand it. And I think that's a very important distinction, that, we think of these people as these horrible, horrific people because that's what history has painted them as. And I'm not saying they're not, but I'm saying that's not all there was to them. They were very good at aligning themselves with the correct people, with the common people, with the majority. Let's see here. Next point to bring up. These people usually have the support of a military, or at least a popular political group. They have some kind of backing. I think in a lot of fantasy stories, you usually see, the bad guy comes in and he conquers the whole land and he takes over, and that's that. And that's not very realistic. Now, him coming in with an army at his back, okay, we can believe that, because that's essentially what put Caesar in power. With Hitler, he had the backing of quite a few of the major political groups, not all of them, but he kind of took care of those. And let's see, what's another example? Genghis Khan. He got the tribes to unite together by eliminating what made them fight. So he essentially had a huge army at his back. So military prowess got you somewhere. And I think the other thing that all of the examples in history we can think of is not only how did they get absolute power, which is kind of what we're talking about here, but how did they keep it? And I think really the answer to that is they built up their inner circle. Each of them had some kind of inner circle. For example, Stalin, when he first came into power, he actually had a fairly small role in the Communist Party when it began, when he was originally elected. But his role allowed him to appoint other party members. So he made it a point of only appointing people who owed him a personal debt. So people that would not be turning on him, essentially. And if you fill your whole inner circle with people like that, then the checks and balances that we try to put in place usually don't work as well. Because now you have technically a group that is maybe officially elected, but if they owe allegiance to someone besides the process of election, then there you go. You have essentially a corrupt system. And I think the other thing is people who live under a dictator, unfortunately, they get used to it. I'm trying to think of the best example I can think of. Let's see. North Korea is a good example. At some point, Soviet Union is a good example because they strictly limited what their people could access, how much information they had. North Korea is an excellent example of this, where they only know what the government or the people in charge allow them to know. So, how can you know there's a better world out there or a different system if you're not allowed to learn about it? And that's also why, in a lot of these cases, when the dictators come in, they usually try to get rid of the folks who had power before or understood that there was another possibility. They tried to get rid of them first because it's much easier to corrupt a much smaller generation, a much younger generation, because they haven't been exposed to the things that their elders have. Let's see. See, this is a fun topic. I like this topic a lot. Um, and I think the other thing to keep in mind is that most of the time when we tell these stories, it's usually around, okay, something's going to happen and, so and so is going to rebel. We're going to get rid of the bad leader, et cetera, which is good. I mean, I'm not saying that's a bad story. I mean, I do it myself. But you have to realize it has to be a specific catalyst. Because, like I said, people that live under a dictator, they get used to it. And unfortunately, people don't like change. Even if it's potentially good change, they don't like it because it's the unknown. So, in the back of their mind, there's this idea of, okay, well, what if we rebel and it's worse off than we were? Then, we would have been better off under, so and so. The devil you know is better than the devil you don't, essentially. So, in order for your people to have reason enough to rebel, essentially their life has to hit a point where conditions under rebellion are preferable to what they are now. So that's why I think a good example in the Hunger Games, when the districts finally start to fight back, they start to fight back stronger when the capital starts putting more restrictions on them and starts running their lives even harsher than they were. And it's a gradual thing, which is also fairly accurate. When the people are slowly put under more restrictive circumstances, the brain kind of adjusts to it. So if it's very sudden, then you're more likely to get people to rebel against it. But if it's gradual and like a little bit at a time, and if you can justify it, like if the government can justify it as, we're doing this for safety, we're doing this to preserve the earth, we're doing this for economics, we're doing this for political, as long as they have a reason and it can reasonably be believed, people are less likely to rebel against it. And remember what I said in the beginning about the country or the population has to be in strife. When we are in strife, we are much more likely to give our rights away. Case in point, I'll use my own country as an example, United States. After 9/11, we voted in the Patriot Act, and we essentially gave the government permission to spy on us because we were afraid. Fear is a very strong motivator. And we are still getting rid of pieces of the Patriot Act, by the way. We've gotten rid of a lot of it, but some of it is still there. And so that's something else to keep in mind when you have a people that are under constant fear. People that are under constant fear, if you have a dictator that is very random in who he, imprisons or kills or whatever, even though you might have a bunch of people that don't want to rebel. You're going to have a lot more people that are willing to take the chance because they're in fear, they're afraid. And so that makes you more likely to take more chances because this part of your brain that does your reasoning, it's not working as well. So that can actually work to your advantage in a story. Oh, let's see. I feel like there was something else I wanted to mention and it's totally slipping my mind. So, of course, as soon as I'm done with this video, I'm going to remember it. Uh, but I think those are like the main basics of how people come into power and how they keep power. Uh, and I'll admit it, I love writing corrupt governments in fiction. It's fun. I also like writing governments that are good and actually do what they're supposed to do. But I do like to see more thought put into these dictatorships and like why they got there. I mean, if you're starting your story and it's been in place for a while, you can still kind of show us, okay, the government has complete power over what these people know, what these people access, and maybe throughout the story we find out that this maybe wasn't always the case. Maybe this is the first big rebellion. And this kind of ties into that other video about power corrupting. So I think if you use those two elements together, you get a really interesting story, and that's always fun. So thank you guys for suggesting this topic. Actually, I've had several people suggest it, and I'm glad I got to talk about it. And it seems appropriate for Halloween night. Let's talk about the evil governments and dictatorships, because I think in a lot of stories, even though I love fantasy creatures, I love mythological creatures, I love scary monsters, I think corrupt people are scarier. That's just me, but I think corrupt people can be a lot scarier than any monster you can pull from your imagination, because it could be anybody. So thank you guys for tuning in this whole Halloween week with me. I really enjoyed doing it. This week we're going to be going back to our regular schedule, so I will be uploading tonight, and I will upload again on Sunday. And as always, if you guys have comments or suggestions, leave them below. I always like to respond to them. And I will see you guys in the next video.